He walked up to my RV with a clipboard in his hand and authority in his eyes. The kind of authority that isn't earned but borrowed. The kind that drips from a title like HOA Compliance Officer. His steps were loud on the pavement, like he wanted me to hear them before I saw him. I was sitting outside, drinking my coffee, enjoying the cool morning breeze when he stopped, adjusted his glasses, and pointed at my RV like it was a crime scene. His voice was sharp and rehearsed, as if he had already told the story to himself in the mirror. "This RV," he said, "is not permitted here. It will be towed in 48 hours. At first I thought it was a joke. I actually laughed. Because how could someone threaten to tow my RV when the patch of ground it sat on was mine? I owned it. I bought the lot with hard-earned money. It wasn't borrowed. It wasn't rented. It wasn't leased. It was mine in the most literal sense of the word. My deed, my taxes, my rules. But the look on his face wasn't playful. He wasn't laughing. He scribbled something on his clipboard like a judge handing down a sentence. And in that moment, I realized this was no mistake. He was serious, and the war was about to begin. There's a certain arrogance in the way HOA enforcers talk, as if a rule book written by strangers decades ago carries more weight than ownership, as if paper in their office means more than the deed in your safe. He pointed to a paragraph in his binder, something about no large vehicles or temporary dwellings parked overnight. He said the words with pride, like they were sacred law. But as he read them out, I saw the flaw instantly. This was no temporary dwelling. This was not a vehicle idling in someone else's driveway. This was my home, parked on my land. The law he waved in my face had no teeth here, but that didn't matter to him. He wasn't there to listen. He was there to enforce. And the more I explained, the more he hardened, like a wall being built brick by brick. I reminded him of the purchase agreement, of the boundaries marked, of the taxes I paid. His response was cold, dismissive. "You agreed to HOA rules when you bought this property," he said. "Ownership doesn't exempt you from compliance." And right there was the hook that made my blood boil. Because yes, I had agreed to some rules. Trash pickup times, noise restrictions, basic courtesy for neighbors, but nowhere did I surrender my right to use my land. Nowhere did it say they could tell me what structure I could or couldn't park on the soil I owned. As he spoke, I could feel neighbors peeking through blinds, curious but silent. That's how HOAs thrive, on silence, on people too tired or too scared to push back. Most folks would give in, move their RV, comply to avoid conflict. But I've never been good at bowing to false authority. And in that moment, I knew something. He didn't. I had read the covenants, the fine print, the pages most people never bother to open. I knew exactly where the loopholes were, exactly where his so-called power stopped. He thought he had me cornered, but he had no idea the ground he stood on was already crumbling beneath him. Still, I let him finish. I let him hand me the notice. Bold letters shouting violation across the top. I let him talk about fines, about towing companies, about how the HOA could escalate if I didn't comply. And the whole time, I kept my coffee steady, my face calm, my eyes locked on his, because deep down, I wanted him to believe he'd won. There's a certain satisfaction in watching arrogance inflate like a balloon, knowing you're the one holding the pin. When he finally turned to leave, confident in his victory, I stood and spoke just loud enough for him to hear, but calm enough to rattle his certainty. "You might want to check the county records before you call that tow truck." He paused, stiffened, but didn't look back. He didn't want to admit doubt. Not yet. But I knew I had planted it. And that seed was going to grow into panic when he realized the truth. Because the truth was simple, undeniable, and in my favor, I owned the lot outright, without conditions, without easements that gave the HOA authority to dictate structure. Their bylaws applied to shared spaces, not private ones. They could tell me not to park on the street, but they couldn't touch what rested inside my own lines. And when that realization hit him, when he saw it in black and white in the records he pretended to know so well, his whole case would collapse. That night, as the sun dipped low and the RV glowed softly under porch lights, I sat and thought about how often this story plays out. HOAs built on intimidation, enforcing with fear instead of law, counting on people's ignorance to keep them compliant. They thrive not because they are right, but because most people never fight. And the more I thought, the angrier I grew. Because this wasn't just about me or my RV. This was about principle, about the idea that ownership should mean something, that no clipboard, no binder, no self-appointed officer should be able to strip away rights you've earned. The next morning, I didn't wait for him to return. I drove down to the county office, pulled the records, and made copies. Every deed, every map, every clause that proved the lot was mine to use. I highlighted the key lines, circled the language that stripped the HOA of authority on private parcels, and stapled it into a neat, undeniable package. I didn't just prepare to defend myself. I prepared to dismantle his entire argument brick by brick. And as I drove back, I could almost hear the scroll of rules in his binder turning to ash. Just like that ancient story of words burned but not forgotten. Because this was not just about parking a vehicle. This was about memory, about dignity, about not letting someone rewrite your rights in the margins of a rule book you never signed. By the time I pulled back into my lot, the neighbors were already whispering. They had seen the notice taped to my RV, seen the officer's smug departure, and now they waited for the showdown. For them, it was entertainment. For me, it was war. And wars aren't won with noise. They're won with truth, with patience, with the confidence that right is on your side. I stepped out, papers in hand, ready for his return. Ready for the moment he would try again to flex borrowed power, ready to show him what real ownership looks like. And as I looked at the horizon, I knew this wasn't over. It was just beginning. Because when you stand your ground against false authority, you don't just fight for yourself, you fight for everyone too afraid to speak. The next morning he came back, clipboard in hand, the same swagger in his walk, like the king of a kingdom no one else believed in. His eyes landed on my RV as if it had personally insulted him. He didn't greet me, didn't pause, just marched straight to the door of the vehicle and slapped a second notice on the window. This one was bolder, red ink screaming the word "Final Warning." He turned to me with a smirk and said, "Tow truck is scheduled. You've got less than 24 hours." I let him talk, let him puff up his chest with borrowed authority, because what he didn't know was that his castle of rules was built on sand, and I was about to wash it away. I walked up slowly, calm, the way you walk when you know you hold the ace. I handed him the packet of documents I had prepared from. The county office, thick pages of deeds, covenants, highlighted lines, maps with bold borders. He looked at them with a kind of dismissive irritation, like a man being handed a puzzle he doesn't want to solve. He flipped a page or two, skimmed, without reading, then handed it back. "Doesn't matter," he said. "Rules are rules." And there it was. The phrase every petty enforcer leans on when the ground shakes beneath them. Rules are rules, but rules without law are just words, and words collapse when truth is louder. I leaned closer, not to threaten, but to make sure. He heard every syllable. "You can schedule all the tow trucks you want. The moment they set foot on this lot, it's trespassing. This is private property. The HOA has no authority here, and the county records prove it." His face changed. Just slightly. A twitch in his jaw, a flicker in his eyes. He wasn't used to pushback. He wasn't used to someone reading the fine print. He stammered, tried to recover with bluster. "You signed the agreement when you bought in," he said. But I shook my head. "No, I signed a deed. I signed taxes. I signed ownership. Your agreement doesn't override that, and if you think otherwise, I suggest you call your lawyer before you call your tow truck. That was the first crack in his armor. He didn't answer right away. He shifted, cleared his throat, suddenly less certain. Neighbors were watching now, blinds tilted open, doors cracked just enough to catch the show. Some even stepped onto porches, sipping coffee like an audience at a play. They wanted to see if I would fold or if the enforcer would back down. And right there was the hook of the whole story. Everyone wanted to know if ownership really meant anything, or if the clipboard ruled supreme. He tried one last push. "You're going to regret this," he said. His voice was thinner now, less steel and more paper. I smiled because paper burns. "The only thing I regret," I said, "is that too many people let you scare them into forgetting what they own." And I turned my back on him, not in disrespect but in dismissal, because you don't bow to authority that isn't real. He stood there a moment, awkward and exposed, then stormed off with more speed than confidence. But I knew this wasn't the end. People like him don't surrender. They regroup. They hide behind meetings, behind committees, behind fine print twisted to suit their will. That night I imagined the boardroom where my name was probably being passed around like contraband. I imagined them plotting, planning new angles, new ways to make me comply. They weren't just after my RV, they were after control. Because if one homeowner stood his ground, others might remember they could too. And to an HOA, that's the greatest threat of all. Not one violation, but one example. The following day I got the letter. Certified mail, official letterhead, language dripping with intimidation. Failure to comply will result in fines, legal action, and forced removal. I read it twice, then pinned it to my wall like a trophy, because every word on that page told me I was winning. If they had the power they claimed, they wouldn't waste time with threats. They would act. But threats mean fear, and fear means weakness. Still, I wasn't reckless. I called my own lawyer, laid out the documents, explained the situation. He laughed. Not at me, but at them. "They don't have a leg to stand on," he said. "If they try to tow it, they'll be the ones facing charges." His words weren't just reassurance. They were fuel. So I waited. And as I waited, something unexpected happened. Neighbors began to approach me quietly in driveways and at mailboxes, like whispers in the wind. "They gave me a violation too," one said. "Told me I couldn't plant a garden bed." Another admitted they had been fined for leaving their trash can out an hour too long. Another for having a shade of paint not listed in the approved palette. One by one, they came with stories, frustrations, wounds from the same enforcer and the same board. They had all been too afraid to push back. Until now. Until someone showed them that authority only works if you let it. And that's when I realized this battle wasn't about me anymore. It was bigger. It was about drawing a line in the sand, not just for one RV, but for every unreasonable rule forced on people who just want to live in peace. The HOA wanted to make an example out of me. Instead, I was about to make an example out of them. The day the tow truck finally came was the day the whole neighborhood woke up. It pulled in slow, loud engine rattling as if trying to announce inevitability. The driver looked uncomfortable, glancing around at the growing crowd of neighbors gathering to watch. The enforcer stood tall beside him, clipboard in hand, smug again, thinking his moment of glory had arrived. But I was ready. I stepped forward with my lawyer at my side, documents in hand, cameras rolling. Yes, cameras, because light is the enemy of intimidation, and once the world sees, the game changes. I held up the deed, pointed to the boundaries, read the clauses aloud. I told the driver in front of everyone that setting foot on my property would make him liable for trespass, for damages, for theft. My lawyer backed me up, citing statute numbers, county regulations, all the things the enforcer hoped no one would ever know. The driver hesitated. He looked at the enforcer, then at me, then back at the papers, and slowly, carefully, he put the truck in reverse. The enforcer's face turned red, anger and embarrassment boiling. He shouted at the driver, ordered him to proceed, but the driver shook his head. "I'm not touching it," he said. "Not worth the lawsuit." The crowd of neighbors erupted in quiet applause, not loud but steady, like the sound of chains breaking. The enforcer snapped, tore the violation notice from my RV, and stormed off, defeated for the first time in front of witnesses who would never forget it. That was the day the balance shifted. The haunting of HOA authority cracked, and in its place grew something stronger: courage. Neighbors who had once bowed now straightened their backs. People who had once stayed silent now asked questions. The enforcer had come to make me bend, but instead he made the community rise, and I knew as I stood there watching his retreat that this was only part of the story. The real fight was still ahead, in boardrooms, in letters, in legal filings. But the spell of fear was broken, and once people stop fearing, no clipboard in the world can control them. After the tow truck left and the enforcer stormed away, the air in the neighborhood felt different. For years, people had tiptoed around rules, terrified of violation letters, fines, and threats. But in that single moment, when the driver refused to touch my RV and the truth stood stronger than the clipboard, something broke. The fear cracked open, and in its place came something dangerous for the HOA: courage. Neighbors who once whispered in secret now spoke openly. That night, I had people knocking on my door, not to complain, but to thank me. Some just wanted to shake my hand, others wanted advice, and a few carried their own violation letters in trembling fingers, asking, "What do we do?" The enforcer had come for my RV, but in doing so, he had awakened the entire community. I knew this wasn't over. Bullies don't walk away after losing one battle. They regroup, they scheme, they try to take back control, and sure enough, a week later the board called a special meeting in the community hall. Flyers went out, official notices posted, urging residents to attend. The language was stiff and ominous. Discussion of escalating violations and community standards. I knew exactly what that meant. They weren't just coming for me anymore. They were coming for everyone who dared to think my victory gave them freedom, too. The night of the meeting, the hall was packed. More neighbors than I'd ever seen gathered, some nervous, some angry, some just curious. At the front sat the board, polished and stiff, papers stacked neatly in front of them. And there, in the center, sat the enforcer, his clipboard at rest but his eyes burning with unfinished business. He spoke first, his tone dripping with authority he no longer fully owned. "We cannot allow disorder," he said. "We cannot allow individuals to undermine the standards that protect this community." He spoke of rules, of harmony, of protecting property values. He painted me as reckless, as someone endangering the order everyone depended on. And for a moment I saw heads nodding. Fear is hard to kill, and old habits cling tightly. When he finished, silence filled the room, heavy and waiting. I stood, papers in hand once again, but this time it wasn't just about me. I read aloud from the county deed, not just mine, but examples that proved the limits of HOA authority. I showed how their rules applied to shared areas, not private parcels. I explained how ownership meant something greater than the board wanted people to believe. And then I did something they didn't expect. I stepped aside and let neighbors speak. One by one, people told their stories. The man fined for his garden. The woman threatened for a paint color. The family written up for leaving holiday decorations out one day too long. As the stories poured out, the nodding shifted. Heads turned, eyes opened. What the board had framed as order now looked like oppression. What they had framed as harmony now looked like control. The enforcer tried to interrupt, tried to wave his clipboard like a weapon, but the room no longer feared the sound of his voice. Every time he spoke, voices rose louder against him. By the end, he sat stiff and red-faced, his power leaking away with every testimony. And when the meeting closed, the board could only promise to review the concerns. They left in silence, their authority bruised, their control shaken. The haunting had spread too far now to be silenced. Days turned into weeks, and something remarkable happened. Neighbors began organizing, not out of fear, but out of hope. They formed committees, not controlled by the board, but by residents themselves. They demanded transparency, demanded elections, demanded accountability. The enforcer's visits grew. Fewer, his notices weaker, until finally he disappeared altogether, replaced by a quieter, more cautious approach. The clipboard had lost its grip, and through it all, my RV remained exactly where it had been, sitting proudly on the lot I owned, not as a vehicle, but as a symbol. It wasn't just about my right to park it. It was about the principle it stood for: ownership, dignity, freedom from unnecessary control. It became a landmark in the neighborhood, not because it was special, but because it represented victory over intimidation. Every time someone passed it, they remembered the night the tow truck backed away, the night fear lost its crown. But victory didn't mean I stopped fighting, because freedom without vigilance is just another temporary illusion. I worked with neighbors to rewrite the bylaws, to strip vague language that gave the board too much power. I attended every meeting, not to argue, but to make sure truth had a seat at the table. I helped others read their deeds, showed them where their rights were buried under legal jargon. Slowly, the neighborhood transformed. It wasn't perfect, but it was freer. And all it took was one refusal, one moment of standing ground. The enforcer eventually left the community, his resignation quiet, his departure barely noticed. For a man who once walked like a king, his exit was almost invisible. But I noticed. And I remembered, because people like him will always exist, in different forms, with different clipboards, trying to enforce power they don't truly own. And the lesson I carried was simple. Power only works if people believe in it. When people stand together, when they know their rights, no clipboard, no binder, no threat of a tow truck can move them. Looking back now, I realize the RV wasn't the real battle. It was just the spark. The real fight was over fear and memory, over whether people would remember that ownership matters, that rules can't erase rights, that silence only feeds control. And once they remembered, the haunting changed. It wasn't a ghost of intimidation anymore. It was a spirit of courage, alive and unstoppable. So when I sit outside now, coffee in hand, the RV steady behind me, I don't just see a vehicle on a lot. I see a victory that belongs to everyone who found their voice. I see a reminder that no matter how loud an enforcer shouts, the truth whispers louder if you let it. And I see a warning, too, that freedom is never given. It's always defended. Sometimes in courts, sometimes in meetings, and sometimes in the simple act of saying no. They threatened to tow my RV. They waved papers, rules, and threats. But in the end, the lot was mine, the law was mine, and the truth was mine. And the haunting they tried to create with fear backfired. It became their downfall. Because once people saw through it, once they realized the power was always theirs, the whole illusion crumbled. So if you ever face the same situation, remember this. Do not bow to fear. Do not surrender to noise, and do not forget what is yours. Read the fine print. Know the law. Stand your ground. Because sometimes all it takes is one refusal to change everything. And that's the story of how an HOA enforcer tried to tow my RV, but ended up towing away his own authority instead. They came with threats, but I stayed with truth. And truth always wins.